Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Xoli Somtose. I'm the chairperson of the session entitled Entrepreneurship and Modern Technologies in the Labor Market, Nexus Between Theory and Practice. Without wasting any time, I'm going to call upon Dr. Professor Thakur, and I'm not going to go through his biography or curriculum vitae because that is already afforded in the repository and the conference documentation. But I will just say Professor Colin Thakur is INSETA Research Chair, Digitalization and Director, NEMIS KZN Skills Collab, Durban University of Technology. And I hand over to you, sir, and all the best to set the stage for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. A good afternoon from Durban and good afternoon to all the delegates. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be with you this afternoon. This topic that the chair just introduced now is quite interesting because my skill set sits some way as an intersection between these three, which seems to be disparate worlds, but my skill set seems to sit right in the middle of this particular one. So I'm particularly interested in this particular topic. So I'm going to try to put the three together in the terms of the way I see things. And anybody who knows me, I wanna be there when the people start to turn it around. Just to say, I'm not electioneering. I do love the president so much, and I always use that song in all my talks. So it's a song of endearment. As anybody who knows me, who hear me in the past, I'm kind of a counterintuitive person. So as Zana Bashov says, I do things backwards. So let's start backwards. So this notion of this labor market that we are talking about in this topic. Sorry, there you go. This notion of this labor market. We, being part of USAf and being part of the AT sector in the country, we look at everything with a skills matrix. Our lens is always tinted with skills. So if we had to look at the labor market, we will be interested in the notion of continuing professional development, of experiential learning, of lifelong learning, of workplace learning, and so on. Of course, that lens that we have has now augmented and sometimes constrained by the 4IR pandemic. Also, the fact that we're literally under house arrest and we have this lack of physicality, which is making our training delivery very, very difficult indeed. So the second thing, going backwards, is this notion of modern technologies. What are the modern technologies out there that we can have, that we can use to maybe redress some of these challenges that we just spoke about? And we know all these big words about skilling and upskilling and reskilling and de-skilling and cross-skilling. And these are all words that are coming into our vocabulary. When Tyler started this notion of a factory, and I'm sure Prabhat is going to talk about, the unit of labor and its impact on productivity, we knew that was going to happen, but there was also a race to the bottom in terms of some skills, which Braverman called, and introduced us to the term of de-skilling. But in my world, in the digitalization world, there's this new trend now to automate labor and robotic process automation. So now we have robots doing what the Taylor did in terms of using science. So, and then of course I need to talk about entrepreneurship. And if I didn't talk about that, Nora Clark would be very upset. So there you go, Nora. I mentioned that word for you. But 4IR itself is by definition a synergy of modern technologies, the cyber, the physical, and the biotechnical. But in our space, in the skill space, how can we reimagine this notion of 4IR? And if we had to look at the world we live in now, our engagement is through LMSs, our engagement is through e-learning. We hope for this blended thing, but so far where we are right now, well, it's not happening as much as it should. So we yearn for this embedded, augmented, immersive type of experience, whatever those words mean, right? We're really looking for that. And this is where Prof. Dimov probably comes into this whole thing, because we're looking at this intersection of innovation and entrepreneurial. Can we co-create content that can allow us to continue with this physicality, this distance that we have? Can we virtualize training using some innovative ways of doing things? And I'm thinking about content co-creation using our retired staff, our current staff, and our current and underemployed students that we have in this country. So let's just assume that we are in a new normal, and it's a no-brainer. We are in a new normal. So let's try reimagining and restructuring this notion of labor training. The claim is that COVID has digitally transformed our lives. The reality, of course, is that COVID has digitized our lives, but it hasn't digitalized our lives. And I have to say this very clearly, that there's a profound difference between these three terms, right? Which I'm not going to go into this today, but today, if you have some time, colleagues, do read about those three different words. So now I'm talking about taking technology, taking 4IR into this LMS e-learning space. How is this going to happen to impact on the labor market? Well, the technologies that we can use, the collaborative technologies that we could use, are all the same old thing that many of you would have heard of: onboarding, simulation, chatbots, augmented and virtual reality, sandbox environment, gamification, animation, and digital twins. I'm just going to go through about 4 or 5 of them, just so that to give you an idea. And what I was looking for, not to give you a primer on what these things are, but to show you scalable instances of where these things are being used. So my purpose and my mission for being part of this year is I want to be part of a community of practice that will drive workplace learning, that will drive experiential learning, and also drive it through a collaborative content co-creation that we could go through. Let me give you the business case. If 100,000 students produce 3 minutes each in the portfolio using those technologies that I spoke about, you would have 300,000 minutes of content. Probably some very bad, but let's be positive and say we have 300,000 minutes of content. If you work that out, it's about 500 hours of improvable content. It's a beautiful way to fail forward, right? So this can also be part of some universities very intuitively use this notion of community service learning in order to get the experiential learning going. So this is where we can partner with our students, and this notion of citizen development and Ubuntu starts coming in. So if you had to look past in the history of technology, all medium to large companies had a librarian, then they had a webmaster, then they had a webmaster and a training manager. Now I submit almost every company, by definition, should have an instructional designer. So if our learners, those 100,000 learners, started doing some content co-creation, they could have some vocation as an instructional designer. So it is purposeful to a certain extent. So I promised you that I'm going to give you practical examples. L'Oreal takes on 10,000 new staff every year across the world in 11 different languages. What do? They inculcate into their staff the L'Oreal culture by giving them apps. So this app onboards staff every single year. They have a magnificent application across the world, across the universe, using 11 different languages, 10,000 types of new staff. If we engage with them to get some experience, we have, our country is similar in terms of languages and mix. Simulation, we all know the beautiful thing that happened in the Hudson River, right? We also know what happened with the 737 and the so-called iPad simulation training. So we know what to do, and now we know what not to do. Simulation is a wonderful way of inculcating training, and students can create mini simulation projects for new students. Chatbots, I put this here deliberately. Chatbot is not what you and I think about. This is a dedicated chatbot that's dedicated to a particular person that doesn't have any bias or preconceived notions of forgetfulness, of tiredness, or fatigue. This chat box will work with one person at a time and work within that person's strengths and weaknesses. So this is now repurposing chatbots from being a service orientating to being a person, to being a virtual citizen that will support a physical human being. Augmented and virtual reality. This is absolutely necessary in our current training world because we can't do things physically. The physicality is our problem. We need to start training people virtually. And VR headsets are really, really interested to train people on conflict management and racial sensitizing, which is what Walmart does. Of course, we're not really going to have Black Friday stampedes anymore, are we? But this is my favorite one, Otis. Otis has 2 million lifts and 68,000 people. So they've given every one of their staff an iPad with augmented reality capabilities. When a technician goes to a lift, he sees that lift for the first time probably in his life and probably the only time. He takes out his AR kit, he looks at the lift, the system automatically determines the type of the lift, and then it takes the technician step by step through the service maintenance process or the service repair process. Now, this is a type of reality. Now, this is already being done with 68,000 workers across the world. So these are the types of replication technologies that we can bring to mediate or mitigate this physicality challenge that we have. Augmented reality. Hyundai, when your car doesn't work, you take out your phone, you walk around your car, and you hold your phone over your dashboard. and it'll tell you how to check for errors or fix problems, or tell you that whether you need to call a repairman or not. So this is almost like an idiot-proof way of helping. If Hyundai can do it under their bonnet, can't we start training our students as well with similar technologies? So, and this one here is, to my mind, something that we really, really need to work on, especially with our health science students and our engineering students, where you really need to teach our students finesse and this tactile sense of how to do things. And because we are doing things virtually, we need to start looking at researching anyway. This is more on the research side, the use of haptic technologies to get things done. Sandbox is a good way for staff to, for students to experiment in real world situations with software, but without causing any harm to the real world whatsoever. So you can imagine, you can try, you can simulate, you can practice, you can do what if scenarios without causing any damage whatsoever. So it allows for creativity, it allows for flair. I'm not going to talk about gamification. I think you guys know about that. But I mean, basically, you know, it's about games. Animation, everybody knows about, but still these are oldish thing that we know about, but we haven't really used them as much as we should. So what I am advocating, colleagues, is that we take these technologies that I spoke about very quickly, I do admit, but I spoke about scalable technologies, technologies that we're all familiar with the vocabulary. I pointed to you examples of companies that are doing that. We should partner with these international or multinational companies, learn from them, take that technology back to our classroom and our universities, start working with our students, let our students become part of the process of failing forward, of us learning how to create this new content. Because look, guys, we've been on this blended learning journey forever. We've gotten nowhere. It was only COVID that pushed us over the tipping point. Thank you.
I wanna be there when the people
Thank
start.
you very much, Professor Thakura, and thank you so much. Appreciated even for keeping the time. Exactly your 10 minutes and you are gone. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Harun Borat. He's a professor of economics, director of development policy research unit at the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Professor Borat.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Let me just call up my PowerPoint. Okay, excellent. So I'm really going to try and do 2 or 3 things in a very short space of time, which is firstly, try and use the economist lens, which is my only lens I have because that's my only training, unfortunately, so I'm hamstrung with that, to try and take us to a space where we can get a quick overview of how economists are thinking about modern technologies and its impact on the labor market, and then do some reflections on how that framework plays itself out in the South African context. So if I just switch, so again, I mean, for this panel, and indeed, Colin has outlined it far more eloquently than I. We all know very well that we are in the midst of the 4th of the industrial revolutions that the modern economy has faced globally, and that's pretty much been has its roots in the 1970s microelectronics revolution. So if you think of our existence with early forms of computing and so on, that's where the origins of the 4IR lie. Most of the technologies are known to you, but just, and I think maybe I'll pivot it very clearly towards the world of work. So that's really where my focus is. How do we think about these technologies in the world of work as opposed to outside, as it were, the world of work? You've got computerized algorithms that run entire industries or sectors in some cases. You've got cloud services that's become a standard purchasing item as part of capital for all companies across all sectors. You've got the Internet of Things, big data analytics. Suddenly everybody from motor industry firms to firms in the motor industry right through to those in financial services, in food and beverages, in retail, all think about big data and big data analytics. And coming with that means that essentially, think about it as a world of work thing, is your hiring decisions, and I'll come to that, will be fundamentally different to, let's say, an old style retailer, right? Artificial intelligence, Colin spoke about robo-advisors and so on. All of that's feeding into how companies are doing business. The sort of headline results, you can get it from the Robots Data Association, is about 2.7 billion robots are in operation globally. The overwhelming majority of them, interestingly, are in China. But the growth rate is really important. They've been growing at about 13% per annum. Just think about that, 13% every year for the last 7 years. So there's no question that the 4R is here to stay. So I just try and get my, okay. So I want to go straight into, the framework, the mental framework for thinking about this is really hard to capture in an image. And this from the World Bank, though, particularly its World Development Report for 2019 does, I think, a really good job. So the idea essentially is that you've got a bunch, if I could just pick up, sorry, Chair, I'm just going to find my, my little laser pointer. So essentially the idea is you're going to find lost employment in what are called old sectors, and that's going to come through automation. But what we often forget about is that through innovation or automation-driven innovation, there's going to be new employment in new sectors. And not to put too fine a point at it, it's really the question is, what's that area there in terms of new employment generation, and what's that area in terms of lost employment? That's the pure numbers difference, right? Of course, those jobs of individuals and skills and occupations and sectors will be very different, or maybe, and that's the empirical question, different from the jobs that are being generated. So simply put, if workers in, let's go right deliberately to a very specific issue for South Africa, in the just transition around the coal industry, if workers in the coal industry are losing their jobs, right? But we say they're going to be mass numbers of new jobs created in new technology sectors, specifically in the sustainable development arena. Are those the same jobs with the same skills requirements? And it's those kinds of tensions that we need to be thinking about from a labor market perspective. Where's some of the evidence coalescing? Well, the evidence coalescing around, let's call it the winners and losers, right? So there's definitely an increased demand for knowledge workers. So those are the workers that we know, all sitting on this call, frankly. We have high levels of technical ability, creative thinking, social intelligence. I'll come through the specific way to think about that. But the typical occupations are the ones that we know, whether it's scientists, academics, IT programmers, professional managers, and so on. There's a really interesting subtext to all of that. And that's that last bullet over here, which is there are those individuals in what are called lousy jobs, what the sort of the North, US and Europe are called service level jobs. Think of those as hamburger flippers at these or domestic workers in service jobs. Those jobs are not easily automated. So in a sense, if one thinks of an occupational distribution, the winners from, at least initially, from technology in the labor market will be those at the top end and those right at the bottom end. And the bottom end is because the current level and in some cases pricing of technology makes it very hard to replace those jobs, right? And so in essence, the losers will be those in the middle of the distribution. So mid-skill occupations performing routine tasks, because routine tasks can be easily replaced given current technology and pricing, easily replaced by machines. And so think of this as sort of workers on the shop floor who used to pack widgets in boxes are now being replaced by machines that can do that. And so repetitive, so here's where the literature has moved, or where our thinking has moved, is instead of thinking about occupations, we think about tasks. Repetitive, routine tasks, that's putting something in a box, is much more easily replaced by a machine than used to be the case. So workers that are in routine task jobs are those that are facing massive threat of replacement. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So continuing in that theme, we can start disaggregating the kinds of occupations into what are called routine and cognitive, or non-routine and non-cognitive, right? Or manual. So here's the easiest in the top right. The non-routine cognitive jobs are those, for example, like engineers, the creative arts, psychologists, management professionals. Their job isn't routine. They're not sort of pressing a button or putting something in a box, and it's highly cognitive. Low probability of automation. High probability of automation, I've got examples here. Let's just go to the bottom left, would be things like construction workers, mechanics, and other individuals in occupations that are manual, but also highly routine and therefore highly predictable. Machines can replace those kinds of jobs. And there are those that are sort of medium probability of automation, such as waiters, security guards, and social workers. So how can we start putting all of this together? And then I want to move into what the early South African evidence shows. If we put all of this together, we can think of these tasks, right? So the routine, non-routine tasks, and try and aggregate them. And what we've done using the literature, and I'll apply this to South Africa, is occupations that have a high information content, high, let's call it automation or routine tasks, have high face-to-face tasks, on-site and decision-making. And perhaps the examples would help us a lot here. I think they always do, for me at least. So think of face-to-face as teachers. Think of high routine jobs as those who are in assembly line work or those who are machine operators. Think of information content jobs as those who are programmers, right? Or bookkeepers or accountants, actuaries, for example. And then on-site would be laborers, shops. So in other words, on-site means that the job can't take place unless you're physically at the workplace. So think of all of this as different typologies of jobs with different task contents, right? The majority of the task content would be routine or face-to-face and so on. What happens is, and this is the pathway of substitutability, this is how technology starts affecting, right, these different tasks and tasks in occupations. It is massively high risk of increased substitutability with technology in jobs such as programmers, assemblers, machine operators. For those jobs, interestingly, such as teachers, those in protective services, there's very little possibility of reduced offshoreability, very little possibility of offshoring those jobs because they have to be done in country, right? So if we take all of this, put it all together, we get to a position where we can start thinking about the impact of technology on the South African labor market. And so the one way you can start picking, and that's the graph I just flashed up now, I'll come to it. One way you can think about the impact on the labor market is, well, what's happening to wages? Because if wages of those workers at the top end, the highly skilled workers, those who are have cognitive jobs, there's a massive demand for those workers, wages will go up. At the bottom end, and I'll come to this, it's possible that those workers are still finding jobs because technology can't really replace them, but perhaps their wages are going up maybe because of protection from the state in the form of minimum wages. So that was our prior, and we looked at wages across the income distribution from the lowest to the highest earners. And some of you who've seen me present this will have seen this graph, which has now disappeared. Okay. You would have seen this graph a couple of times. And this is a graph of the growth in real wages for the period 2000 to 2015 for South Africa across the distribution. So lowest to highest wage earners. Highest wage earners are seeing significant growth in average annual real wages, and so are those at the bottom end. Here's your problem and your challenge, colleagues, is the missing middle. So you've got workers in the middle of the distribution who are actually seeing an erosion of real wages. This, in the technology sense, is cognitive, highly cognitive, non-routine jobs seeing high increases in wages, and lousy jobs, service level jobs where machines can't go yet are actually seeing an increase in wages assisted by minimum wages, and the job losses are happening for those on the shop floor. Those blue-collar workers who are in routine task jobs. Think of those packing boxes, right? Those jobs are going, and you're seeing that through a decline in wages in the middle of the distribution. If I want to embellish that further, and I take you saw that those 5 classes of tasks: information content, automotive jobs, face-to-face, on-site, and decision-making. I see this playing out very powerfully for South Africa. So what are the key results? So take the green dotted line, that's on-site work. And essentially think of that as domestic workers or farm workers. Their wages have increased at the bottom end, right? The real wage change has increased dramatically. That's as a result of minimum wages. What about this little yellow line here? Almost like green, a dip, and then the yellow line is basically decision-making jobs with high decision-making content, massive increases at the top end. Here's the problem, colleagues, at the bottom. So jobs, the red line for now, with high automotive contents, that means high routine tasks that can be replaced by technology. Wages have been eroded here in the middle of the distribution. Effectively, jobs are being lost and wages are declining as machines have taken over jobs in the middle of the distribution. So in essence, putting it all together, you've got analytical, decision-making, and creative tasks which are required for these high-skilled, and if you look at the sectoral work, it's finance and sort of public sector type jobs where you see for South Africa, increased returns at the top end. The public sector story is slightly different. The bottom end has been face-to-face sort of on-site jobs, such as those in social and personal care. So that'll be domestic work, farm work, and that's been massively aided security work by minimum wage legislation. The problem is that the middle of the distribution is collapsing. So in sectors such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, those jobs are being lost, and they're being lost at the doorstep of technology, which is replacing these routine tasks. The challenge, I would argue, and I'm almost done, is really not to say, can we roll back the fourth industrial revolution? That's right. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So the idea is, we know that fourth industrial revolution is here to stay. Can we think of those task content jobs that actually may be disappearing and being replaced by those at the top end? And if that's the case, where can we align the supply side, right? Institutions of higher education, the schooling system, to make sure that those new jobs have a queue of people ready to take them up, right? It's not about saving the old jobs, it's making sure that as the 4IR kicks in, we can take advantage in terms of employment needs of those new jobs. Thank you, Chair. I think I've saved you 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. But let me correct you, because we are talking about the impact in labor market here. So I've got to be correct. You've saved me 3 minutes. So, but thank you for saving that 3 minutes. And thank you very much, Professor Borat, for your presentation. This is such an enlightening moment for us as listeners. I will contribute, therefore, the 2 minutes to our next speaker, which is Professor Dimo Dimov, Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the University of Bath in United Kingdom, and co-founder of Kinetic Thinking. The rest of his biography is in your package for this conference, if people are interested in that. But now it's time for me to call upon Professor Dimov. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mdoze, for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone from the UK, from Bath. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts with you around what is a very, very important and timely topic. I just want to say at the start that having listened to the presentations that came before, that what I'll offer is probably a shift of perspective. So one of the shifts is not looking at the system as a whole and people as a source of labor or skills that they deploy and exchange in the labor market. I'd like to focus on individual people, so take their point of view as a source of aspirations, looking for meaning, trying to make a positive impact on the world. And that's why my focus is on developing entrepreneurial thinking. So what is it that we as universities can do in this new environment to develop new ways of thinking amongst our students, to enable them to engage in the world in a way that fulfills their aspirations and make a positive impact. So this is a different perspective, ground level, if you wish, from those who act entrepreneurially in the world. So my starting point would be to think about what is going on these days as almost a sort of new world. So we've heard about the fourth industrial revolution and all this blending that occurs between physical, biological, and digital, and makes the environment a lot more complex and faster changing. But from an entrepreneurial and innovation point of view, we can say that the impact of this is prominent in two ways. On the one hand, we have digital technologies and their accessibilities, and they effectively do three things. They enable us to reach large audiences very quickly, and this is through the power of social networks. Also, they make knowledge very accessible through all these knowledge platforms where, you know, we can look up and take courses everywhere. So this, in a way, makes us think about what is it that we uniquely hold as universities when students can source knowledge globally, if you wish. So knowledge is very accessible about things. And finally, with a lot of the tools that are available now in the cloud, a lot of productivity tools, we can experiment, we can create prototypes, we can illustrate our ideas, we can communicate with others, and we can do this very easily. So experimentation, the cost of experimentation has gone down. So these days, obviously, it depends on the type of idea, the type of venture you want to launch. It can be very easy. People, and I see some of our students, they can go from idea to launching something to show to the world almost within half a day, if they're always skilled in putting up websites and creating prototypes and engaging. So we have this on one side where the cost of engaging in entrepreneurship has gone down significantly compared to just 10, 20 years ago. On the other hand, we have what we know about, you know, some people would refer to Generation Z, or the new generation of students, thinkers coming through. And one of the things that is notable, and I can share some of the numbers that we know, for example, about the UK, but we do know that a significant number are interested in primarily in starting their own business. And this, in a surprising way, this is now over a quarter of students in UK universities have that aspiration. And in fact, some data would show that 10% of them actually start a business while at university. So this is a significant number. So they see this as a response to two. One is this idea of a lifelong employment and trying to sell skills in the job market, and companies offering jobs. In a way, they can see a shift in that environment. So the mantra is actually we can create our own jobs, and that's where the entrepreneurial spirit comes from. Then comes a desire to make social impact. So often it's not purely an economic motivation. There's a very strong social component, and they can, of course, leverage, mobilize their peers very quickly and create some early feedback or traction for their ideas. So these two forces, the digital technologies and this personal drive that we see, creates a very vibrant entrepreneurial space. Now, I also want to give you a slight historical reflections, and I want to pick up on the fact that we're engaged in a conference that spans across the globe, and here I am looking at my screen in the UK, and I'm communicating with a large audience in South Africa and beyond. And of course, we're on Zoom, and that is relevant in two ways. So this is my historical. First of all, Zoom, obviously, this is digital communication, and you can see in the picture on the left, this is Steve Sasson at Kodak inventing the digital camera in 1975. And of course, we do know the story that Kodak never capitalized on that invention. They were too focused on films, on film photography, and basically overlooked digital. And who would have imagined that this clunky device that Steve Sasson is holding in the picture, as you can see, assembled from all these different devices, who can imagine that would fit in a phone with a vastly greater quality just 40 years later? So we could not have imagined that it would develop in this particular way. The second story is that of Zoom, Eric Yuan, who worked for Cisco and their WebEx division, and he had this idea of a different and a better platform. And this was the idea that was shot down at Cisco, and he left Cisco to start Zoom. And of course, we see how well Zoom has done before. But the broader point here is that we see in both cases ideas that are put forward that are met with skepticism initially, because they imagine a world that is vastly different. And that skepticism leads us to dismiss people as these ideas are crazy, this is not going to work out. But yet these are individuals who, in pursuing those ideas, they can leave a lasting impact on the world. And that brings to me a couple of perspectives. The first one is one of my favorite quotes by George Bernard Shaw, who say, "The unreasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man, woman, unreasonable person." And think about what unreasonable means. In many ways, this is about going against what the consensus is, which brings me to the second side of the screen, which is a quote by Mark Andreessen. He's a prominent venture capitalist with Andreessen Horowitz, but he was also the creator, the founder of Netscape, which offered the first browser back in 1994. And he says, as a venture capitalist, we look back at all the investments that we've made, and the ones that have generated the most significant returns have two characteristics. Obviously, they've been successful as businesses, but most importantly, they have been non-consensus. And non-consensus basically means investing in things that look like they're just crazy. So I hope you can see the parallel here between non-reasonable and crazy as something that generates impact. And of course, to link this to economic theory, this of course corresponds to the Schumpeterian notion of the entrepreneur as innovator who changes and disrupts things, but not in a way that can be anticipated beforehand. So this gives us a way of thinking about the entrepreneurial space. And I've put here the two dimensions: consensus, non-consensus on one hand, and on the other hand, success and failure. And based on what we can surmise from the code before, if we do things in a consensus space and they work well, then this would generate what economists would call normal returns. So we effectively earn the cost of capital. And everything is compensated, and this is normal and expected. Of course, we can invest in good areas, but they can fail, and we could call this abnormal failure, in the sense that it was failure that would be unexpected in many ways. Now, these are the abnormal returns that Mark Andreessen was talking about, and this is going for a non-consensus space and succeeding. So that's abnormal returns because we change, reframe expectations, and things change fundamentally. The meaning of a lot of things changes. And of course, this also means that for the sake of symmetry, our last quadrant would be normal failure, which also means that when we go against the grain, when we go with non-consensus idea, of course, the normal expectations would be a lot of these would not work out. But it is the small percentages that do work out that have this sizable and tremendous impact. Now, why is this interesting in the context of universities and entrepreneurship? Well, the top part, this idea of consensus, non-consensus, has to do with knowledge. And knowledge, as we know, is we look for facts. What is the way that the world is, and what can we say as a way of explaining it? So that's how we think about knowledge. And our knowledge enables us to talk about ideas and say, well, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. This is where consensus, non-consensus comes from. The second distinction between success and failure, of course, this is a question of time. Whether an idea succeeds or fails is something that can be revealed only across time. And when we think about time and future, then this becomes a question of possibilities. So there is a question of what is possible now, and in many ways, everything and many things are possible, but only time will tell us whether things end up as good ideas or bad ideas. And of course, the university is a space that disseminates knowledge. So the realm of knowledge is what universities are about. And we can think about our role in consensus versus non-consensus. To what extent, as universities, we want to enable people to engage in non-consensus areas as a way of pushing boundaries. And entrepreneurship is this sense of taking those ideas forward so they can be revealed across time as working out or not. So this is the intersection, the point between universities and entrepreneurship. And some of the tension arises when we think about our ideas, where we say, well, actually, to do things, we would like to know first in order to know whether this is a good idea to proceed or not. But in many ways, we need to do things first in order to know. And this is what experimentation, this is what serendipity gives us. So by doing things, we're able to create new knowledge, which again expands our knowledge, enables us to do yet newer things. So we have a sense here of this, a person who wants to engage with the world and make a positive impact. And I'd like to see this as an interplay between mind and world. And there's a tension in that. And again, I'd like to offer two quotes I found inspiring. One is from Lewis Carroll, who says that the imagination is the only weapon in the war against reality. And this is the sense that if we're able to imagine things that can mobilize us to do things that we wouldn't necessarily have done without the imagination. And we know that in science, sometimes we're only able to discover facts if we're able to imagine the spaces in which to look for facts. So imagination is really, really powerful driver. At the same time, the world is something that is out there and responds. And this is, the quote here is by Mike Tyson, is this very fast context of boxing. And is everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And this is this thing that no matter how much we imagine, it's ultimately that the world that responds and tells us whether certain things work or not. So with this in mind, we can see entrepreneurship as a space where we can exercise both art and skill. In my work and in teaching and in working in the area of entrepreneurship, I see this space in which we exercise our entrepreneurial exploration as a triangle of three things. So as a person, as an agent of change, we'd like to imagine the way the world would be. So we'd like to see impact in the market, whether this is new products, new services, things that do not exist, or improvements to existing things. And we're able to articulate that as a concept for what we're trying to do. So I call this a process of framing, which is very much an exercise of imagination. But that needs to be made real, so that we engage in the process of modeling, where ultimately whether a business succeeds or fails is a question of finding a viable business model design. And even if we have a viable business model, to actually build a business requires, and this is where skills and performing comes into place, so we still have to execute and make things work. So what I find fascinating about the triangles is that you can see this as a moving whole, and if you move any of the three pieces, the other two gets affected a bit. So bring in new people and you get more imagination, you can get different concepts. Change a concept, the model changes as well. If a current model is not executable, you adopt the model, change the frame. So we're able to move in that triangle. But what this places a focus on is on the entrepreneur as a thinker. Is engaging in the world responds, but the entrepreneur is in a position to think about what to do next. And this idea of thinking about what to do next at any point of the way is what I'd like to refer to as a shift in stance. So we're not engaged in the world in a linear way where we just do things, we observe the outcome and we try again, and we just focus on trying to achieve a particular outcomes. But it is that at every point of the way, and I call this a recursive loop, at any point in the way, we get to reflect about who we are, what is the meaning of where we operate, and perhaps what is the way in which we're trying to engage with others. So this is the sense in which we can shift gear, we can reframe, we can pivot, we have the opportunity to respond. And that then brings us into the space of thinking, this realm of thinking, which can be defined in a very simple way as we as thinkers operating, acting in the world, we really have two levers of experience at our disposal. The first one is the premises that we use in thinking about what to do. And these premises are effectively what we take as true. our current theory of the world, if you wish. On the basis of these premises, we formulate our commitments, so the actions they would like to exercise. In a way, these commitments represent what we'd like to make true. So the two things within our control is what we take as true and what we like to make through. And of course, when we act, the world responds and consequences are generated. But the really powerful loop in this case is that feedback loop, which means that when the world responds, we can revisit our premises and our commitments, and we can act and react again. So this is a space in which we can think about how do we engage with students, how do we develop thinking, and how do we work with them. So this question of what the premises, what we take is true, and what we want to make through is a realm of meaning. This is think about the premises, the implicit. It could be based on culture, it could be based on socialization, it could be based on our experience so far, but all the things that we take for granted, from which we construct the meaning of the world around us. Consequences arises from this sense of the world as a complex interconnected system, which we can never fully understand, but we can act upon, and it responds back. And these are the signals from which we have to construct things. And that loop in the middle, the ability to respond in each step of the way, is this idea of recursivity. So these are three primary ideas, if you wish, in this space of thinking. Meaning, which means that meaning arises from our thinking. Systems, which means that everything is interconnected and we're never in full control. But recursivity is our ability to respond to things at each step of the way. So I'd like to wrap and finish, just to give you an example from the work that we have been doing here at the university and beyond, how we can translate these conceptual ideas into a framework for thinking about the entrepreneur as an agent of change, engaged with the world, and trying to navigate these two extremes, if you wish. And these two extremes, one is a stable system, is something that's regulated, and this idea of trying to control and regulate and bring order to things. But the other one is this sense of novelty, new ideas, and trying to push boundaries and trying to expand. So complexity, learning, coevolution, all of these things arise from this interplay between regulation and novelty. And regulation and novelty is described, is manifested in what we see. So this is the premises that we have. So seeing, and this varies between structure, seeing the world as predefined as structures, or as openness, seeing the world as what is not yet, what we imagine. So this is at the level of seeing. And at the level of doing, this is about whether in deciding what to do, we rely on reason or being able to justify what we do, or whether we decide to be playful and try to experiment and provoke and push boundaries and see if we can invite serendipity and generate interesting consequences. So this combination between seeing and doing in the way they move between these two extremes work out to help us make thinking visible. And we can talk about people having distinct styles of thinking, which have these different combinations of seeing and doing. So focus, playful, incremental, and breakaway. And the way we work with these is that if we work with a cohort of, it could be an organization with a class of students or with teams, and if they work through the instrument, the assessment instrument that we've created to help people visualize their thinking, we're able to see thinking as this vast cloud and diverse cloud. So we're able to see diversity in thinking in universities and teams and organizations. And we can begin to think about how can we leverage this best. So some of these tools for visualization, we use for developmental purposes. And the main goal that we see as educators, of learning ambassadors, is to unlock and develop new ways of thinking in people, where we can move from our default way of thinking, which is something that reflects our socialization experience and habits, so to say, to becoming more kinetic in our thinking, which is about having the ability to respond to situations in different ways. Just as a summary, this gives us a way of engaging with thinking as a wide spectrum, where we can move away from what is simply familiar to us. And we can think about, imagine really wild and absurd things as a way of moving outside of the familiar and getting this exciting realm of surprises. And surprises, and these are things that we can leverage upon, and this is how we can take innovations forward. So here's my closing slide. I'm right at the edge of my time, and I appreciate the extra 2 minutes that were given. Age of the fourth industrial revolution. We have this unfounded fear that machines will someday start thinking like humans, but what we should really fear is that humans have already started thinking like machines. So, and I'll leave you to reflect on this quote, which I think is very, very powerful. And this is my last slide here. For those of you who are interested in exploring some of the tools that we have, this is some further materials that you can find on the link here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Professor Dimov. And on behalf of the country, higher education, South Africa, and the organizers of this conference, and Professor Bauer, I would like to make a special thanks to you for joining us all the way from UK and bring us such informative, insightful, and enlightening presentation. Before I leave, I think I owe it to all three presenters to say this was a true reflection of connectedness between theory and practice. And it just happened that all three of you came together and you made it happen for this session. I would like to thank all of you and say I am convinced to Dr. Meyer that this was the best session for this conference. I will close with those words to say this has been the best. So thank you, Professor Borat, Professor Thaka, and as well as you, Professor Dimov, for making this brilliant session and make me feel so proud as the chair of this session. It was a blessed session, I can say. So without wasting time, I am going, and also your timing for all of you was just perfect. I will now hand over to Dr. Meyer to take us forward. And you presenters are going to be here. And we have got participants that are eager and excited this afternoon to ask some questions. Over to you, Dr. Meyer.
Thank you, Prof. Tosi. And it was an excellent session also because you chaired it. I always say to people, you are one of the most underestimated academics and thought leaders across the academy. So thank you so much to you, Prof.
Thank you so much.
We are now going to, Prof, I hope that you're still going to stay with us for a few minutes.
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Prof. We're very, very grateful for all the time that you are available. I want to move over and I'm going to allow certain respondents to come in and to provide some responses to the very insightful thoughts that have been shared with us. I just want to summarize by saying that Prof. Borat is well known to us. He speaks on the context of our reality, as we always say, that our labor economic situation is underpinned by great inequality, the largest Gini coefficient disparity in the world, the largest youth unemployment in the world, and the largest growing unemployment in the world. So this session really is constructed around what our reality is and what we need to prepare for the future. I know that Professor Takir, you are well known within the preparation and the global context of what it is that we need to prepare for. But I want to give a very special word of thanks to Professor Dimov. He's one of the individuals that I follow around globally on the speaker stage. His thoughts are constructed unusually. He comes with new and innovative ideas, but also in his own right, he's a very successful entrepreneur. So given this context, we are going to first ask that Professor Takir comes back and responds to us on the speakers, the speakers that followed him, the two speakers that followed immediately after him. And then we're going to ask Ms. Didat, who's obviously very well known to the entire sector, the acting executive director of the National Labour and Economic Development Institute, NALEDI. And then what we will have is, in the time that remains, we will be posing direct questions to Professor Borat and to Professor Dimov, also from the speakers, as Professor Baxton will put this in the chat for us, but also direct questions from the chair, from myself, around the inputs that have been made. So with that, I'm handing over to Professor Takir. And Professor Takir, we're giving you 10 minutes just to share your thoughts on the earlier input that was presented. Thank you so much. Professor Takir, over to you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Prof. Dimov, Prof. Barat, for your insightful talks. I suspect that Professor Bauer engineered this, that I become a respondent, because he knows I have an attention span of a 2-year-old. So he made sure that I listen to you and reflect on what you said. So it's a very clever way of educating me. So thanks to the USAf team for that. Prof. Bharat, I love your take on the innovation dimension when you were speaking, and I note the point that you made in terms of the 2.7 million 2.7 million robots that are now deployed out there working, non-unionized automated robots that don't ask for leave and don't ever need to do anything. They don't need to go to the mall or stuff like that. They work more or less continuously. So we've had that kind of fear as well. I'd like to just reflect on that point that you made and remind the audience that back in the 80s when the PC was born, the typing pool disappeared. It was an automatic consequence of everyone starting to use what we used to call WordStar and WordPerfect and things like that, because people took on the responsibility of typing on their own documents. So within months, massive typing pools across the world disappeared. In fact, the introduction of the PC resulted in 3.2 million jobs being lost. But within 5 years, 18.2 million new jobs were taken. So your point about 2.7 million robots being deployed, yes, it's a new kind of work. Sometimes it has the impact of displacement. At other times, it actually has the impact of giving us some ingenuity to create new kinds of work for the people that are there. And I always make the point that we forget the value of the shop floor staff, the intuitiveness that they have that robots don't have. Robots have the ability to automate only the automated parts of it that they see. But robots don't see intuition. They don't see the value that some staff have. So we also need to start reinforcing the value that people see and believe in themselves. So I'm really keen on exploring that innovative dimension. Firstly, as a survival means, because we really need to see how these new notions of 4IR that you spoke about, what new things that it create. And I remind you, I just graduated a master's student this week in using drone technology for environmental monitoring. And I'm overwhelmed with the amount of work that I'm getting now from people who are bringing drone data to us to do data science analysis for them. And so I went and did a little bit of literature review with my student, and it turns out that the US government is employing 70,000 people just to go over manual photographs to look for insights. So there was a theory that drones were going to take away logistic work, but it's actually creating other kinds of work. So I'm pretty keen on that. Chair, would it be okay if I ask Prof. to respond to that? Otherwise, it's just going to be me speaking.
No, certainly. I think that yes. if you have particular questions, please feel free to pose them.
So, Prof. that was the one point on your view of robots becoming a little bit. Yes, they will be a threat in the short term, but in the medium term, I'm hoping and hopeful that things will get better. The other point that you made about reducing offshore ability, I want to ask you, with your economic hat on, I've always said that if you look at the Indian model, they've started off by exporting people, clever people, and then they kept him and they created the best BPO destination in the world, and then they started charging us in dollars. And, so they became very, very smart at what they did. Given our geographic locality in the world, given our excess in skills, do you think that we cannot replicate a near-shore kind of activity? Can I ask you those two questions, sir?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I think what's, as much as the 4IR or whatever phrase you want to use is a certainty, we also know that there will be adjustment costs, let's call it that, right? And that happens in a dynamic sense, in a time-based sense. And I know that the commentators to follow us will also reflect on that. So what do we mean? Well, so it means that we can see the signals coming from the economy, from firms, with respect to, let's simplify, replacement of labor with capital, be it robots or whatever the case may be. Then the question is, can the institutions of human capital, whether it's the higher education system, the schooling system, orientate itself quickly enough so that we meet the needs of firms for these new skills, for these new types of occupations? And then the second thing is, in that process, though, there is absolutely no doubt that workers face the threat of job losses, right? And so for me, the role then is very clear for public policy to find a way in which to ameliorate those adjustment costs, right? Call it a social plan, call it the just transition, there are all sorts of phrases, but essentially what you're trying to do is make sure that the transition is managed, at least in terms of the welfare and support to workers. In, of course, a fiscally responsible way and all that sort of thing. But the key thing is you're trying to do two things. One is let's manage the supply side of labor so that we've got appropriately skilled, appropriately, let's say, individuals with the skills that are in need by firms in these new technologies, and then secondly, manage the adjustment costs. Yeah, the reshoring is an interesting one. I like that comment, Colin, because and Linda partly reflected on it. I think there is a danger that we overstate the homogeneity. You partly picked up on it in terms of the Otis and the lift operators. We overstate the homogeneity of technology's replacement ability, let's call it, right? So in other words, it's actually really difficult from end to end to make a piece of clothing, right, using only machines. You do need human intervention. And it's very, very difficult to see how that's going to be possible without some human intervention. The ratio may change, but I think, the extent to which technologies can replace workers there is an upper bound, and we need to accept that. Then just finally on nearshoring, I think firms need just-in-time production. So so we shouldn't overstate the fact that we are losing all our productive capabilities to China, to Vietnam or Bangladesh, say in clothing or textiles or whatever the case may be. Yes, that's partly true, but firms also want distance. They want firms to be close by so that they can get supply in the next week or in the next 2 weeks, which, shipping and transport distances mean that it's very, very difficult to do that through faraway countries. So reshoring is actually a really important opportunity for sectors, even within using new technologies. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Session Chair, I wanted to ask Prof. Dimov one question. Is that okay, or can I just make the comment? I don't mind.
Certainly. If I could ask that it's a brief
it's a straightforward question.
please,
Prof,
Prof
Dimov,
thank you.
I'm sorry, Prof. We got carried away talking, but I really enjoyed your talk. I was intrigued by the remark that you made that 10% of the students, start business while at university. Is this your experience at the University of Bath? Is this your observation in the European context? It's music to our ears. Your comment on that? Did you inculcate a culture, or how did it happen?
Oh, this is it is our experience at the University of Bath, and I wish I could say we've inculcated the culture, but this is actually data that comes from Santander. They run entrepreneurship programs across UK universities, so they have data that speaks to the entire sector, the higher education sector in the UK. And so this was numbers that I picked from them, and this is what they say. So we see this in Bath. We see this huge appetite for all this, and students come in. I am aware that students do start while at university, but this is they've actually said that this is sector wide. So this so I would imagine this number is higher in some universities, perhaps lower in others, but 10% is something that they report across.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Takir. We will now hand over to Ms. Hamida Didat. She's the Acting Executive Director of NALEDI, the research arm of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and she has been in this position since 2016. This has been a very long acting stint. Ms. Didat, I hope that they appoint you shortly, specifically because you are obviously from the labor movements, and we know that technically you should have already been appointed. So I just want to say that, yes, ma'am. I just want to say that you've done phenomenal work. We know within your research construct in internationalization, climate change, as well as the fourth industrial revolution, and contextualizing for us that this 4IR is just an overused word, and really we are in the frame of the new technology moment. And it is my great pleasure to hand over to you. You are one of the speakers that we obviously have been very excited to welcome, and we look forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of network problems. So thanks very much both to Professor Chakur, to Harun, who I'm very familiar with, and to Professor Dumo. I'd like to start with Harun's positioning. I mean, obviously within the economic framework, Harun, that you're presenting, it's obviously what we currently.
Sorry, Ms. Didat, could I ask that you just switch your camera off just to help us with the bandwidth so we can hear you clearly?
That's fine. I prefer it that way anyway. So thank
much
you
better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start off with Harun first. And I mean, Harun and I are quite familiar with each other. Obviously, I come from the other perspective, noting that we challenge the economic paradigm within which we're currently operating. So while there's synergies in relation to the fact that, yes, there's innovation, there's possibilities for job creation, I think what we need to be thinking about, and I think as we've been looking at this particular issue from a labor perspective, is that you can't discuss the 4IR without the future of work as two sides of the same coin. And I think both, all of the speakers have basically alluded to the fact that there's potential for job creation. And I like the example that was used in relation to the typewriter vis-a-vis the computer. So typists were in a pool, were working, and then the next thing, there were no longer typewriters, and then you eventually had this boom in relation to job creation. So I think from a labor perspective, it's really quite challenging when you're confronted with innovation, to be able to get workers as well as the unions to be able to rethink the way in which the world of work in particular. I think in many instances for us, more than the fact that it's called a fourth industrial revolution, I think you alluded to it, it's more like a euphemism, because it actually means workplace restructuring. In many instances, it would mean downsizing, it would mean innovation, it would be creativity, but it would also mean major job losses. And when you talk about job losses in the context of the current economic paradigm, with, as Professor Burat indicated, high levels of unemployment within the youth, amongst the youth in particular. And I think what COVID-19 has definitely illustrated quite significantly is that we're not going to turn around towards innovation and bring everybody on board in a very short space of time. If you look at what the current analysis is in relation to the schooling time or the education challenges that we're currently experiencing as a result of school time being lost, they're saying it would take children at least 3 years to be able to recoup the time lost. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there's a major mismatch between students that are actually graduating from universities vis-a-vis what the actual labor market currently needs. And that's without bringing in 4IR, digitization, or robots into the equation. So I think what I really, Professor Chakur was really good. I think what you presented, and I think in some ways with the synergy in relation to, because I didn't see your presentation in terms of challenging a paradigm, but what you were saying is clearly there's a challenge in relation to the higher education system, and how do we actually speak to the 4IR and what are the innovations that could come from that. And I think it was really it was quite an eye-opening presentation. But I think from a labor perspective as well in relation to skills, I like the fact that you were looking at the possibilities for job creation and the potential for that. So that's a very important space or point of departure to be moving from, and it's also quite consoling. I was very enthused by Professor de Merwe, I must say, coming from a labor perspective, obviously on the other side of the paradigm. So being innovative, creative, and actually thinking outside of the box, thinking of different systems, and thinking of what we refer to as a principle rather than a phrase in relation to the just transition. I think the whole process of the 4IR vis-a-vis the future of work provides us with labor as an opportunity to really think out of the box. I think as much as you're talking about entrepreneurship, it can be workers that are actually the entrepreneurs. So rather than investing in companies, it might be worthwhile us investing in the actual app, or actually investing in the robots itself, and actually thinking about how we do less labor time, and actually appropriate the wealth. And I think in actual fact, the one thing about the innovation around 4IR is it can do two really significant things. Number one, from a gender perspective, and this is the theory I have, and I haven't tested it out, but I mean, can you imagine if every government introduces a robot to do domestic work, or if you have an automated laundry system, where a lot of the social reproductive work is actually done by robots as opposed to women, we'd be able to facilitate a process where women would enter the labor market in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have. So I think it definitely presents us with a creative and innovative way of really fundamentally transforming gender equity. I think on the labor perspective, I mean, it would be wonderful if women and men could actually spend a whole lot of time with their families doing courses that they want to work, or that they would like to do, you know, really enhancing their quality of life, rather than actually doing the mundane. And I want to pick up on the point that Professor Thoko raised in relation to the value of human beings. You know, we'd gone through when the president had started his commission around, and there was major discussion around the 4IR. We'd engaged somebody from Accenture, and I remember a lot of comrades coming to me and said, "Oh my God, you're actually engaging in business." But I must say there was quite an innovative approach that Accenture is using in relation, and I think they'd appreciate a lot of what Professor de Merwe was presenting. There's a realization, and I think it's really important for us that it's coming from a business like Accenture, acknowledging that you cannot have either or, and I think Harun you know, made mention of that. So SARChI, for example, is actually doing that, where they've taken the factories, introduced automated technologies, but also ensured that they've upskilled and upgraded workers who otherwise would be doing shop floor mundane work, given them new job descriptions, you know, innovative skills, and they're actually running the automated systems. So there's definitely the potential, but we cannot underestimate social value and human beings and human touch. I mean, we've all experienced COVID. If you know, after almost a year and a half of not actually being able to go to conferences or having contact, I think if you ask people, given a safe environment, would they love to meet their friends and have a cup of coffee as opposed to doing it over Zoom? I think every single person would say yes. You know, when you talk about automating, having a robot doing your hair, you can have the most innovative cuts you know, in terms of hairstyles, but nobody can provide you the social support and the free psychology and the social interaction that you would when you go and visit your hairdresser. So I think the humane connection and humanity as a commodity, I very seldom use that as a term, but will never ever go off the market. That's my view. So we can have innovation, we can have the 4IR, and we will definitely have several revolutions that all restructure the world, but you will never be able to restructure humanity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Those are very insightful words. And I think if we lose touch about humanity and what our purpose is, and that we're part of a larger social construct, and also that we have a responsibility within the social compact to ensure that role players are protected. Each country has its particular nuances. South Africa is obviously marred with great wealth, but also great poverty. And how do we balance that in preparation of our future? The next question I'm going to ask is to Professor Dimov. And Prof, what I would like to ask you, you obviously understand that within Africa, South Africa is the second largest economy on the African continent. And we have many people that are fixated, if I may say, with 4IR and what this means. And we obviously understand that 4IR has come with us since 2016 when it was announced, and it means digitization, and that we've seen this at the start of the 21st century. And what this means to us, as Professor Thoko said, is around AI, robotics, big data, blockchain, crypto, etc. And that robotics and artificial intelligence and augmented reality is already part of our fabric. It's not something new that's being evolved. But what I want to ask you is, as we prepare and transcend, as we are the precipice of the 5th industrial revolution, that will see innovation and purpose and inclusivity, and also a deep multi-level cooperation between people and machines and consciousness. You ended up by saying that it's not about us speaking about machines, that we are already starting to think as humans like machines. And I would like to pause there and just get your thoughts about the preparation of what it is we need to do as humanity and society as we move forward in preparation of this new world that we are on the precipice of entering. Thank you, Professor Dima.
Thank you very much. It is a great question. Perhaps my way of answering it, I'm not sure I can provide a simple answer, but I'd like to take us back to what is it that the children have when they we enjoy watching children grow and looking at how they interact with the world. And there's two things that children have that we often try to rediscover as adults. And they have imagination, so they really like to imagine a different world around it. This is where imaginative play. And they're also curious. They like to engage and provoke the world around them as a way of getting into interesting spaces. And these two characteristics, imagination and curiosity, I think are very much human characteristics. They underpin human culture with all its flourishing, the flourishing impact that it's had on humanity. So imagination, curiosity is something. These are things that we tend to lose as we, as we grow older, as we go through educational systems, as we socialize, and it so often happens that later on, as part of adult education, as part of executive development, the focus is then how do we re-engage with our imagination? How do we stay curious? So this is the answer that I would give you. It's not to lose touch with these really primary faculties, which is imagination and curiosities, which is something that I think inherently computers and machines do not have.
Thank you very much, Professor Dima. I would now like to ask Professor Bharat. Professor, you spoke about the job typologies that are currently with us. And Professor Bharat, what I want to ask you is, we know and we've seen globally as the American economy starts opening up, that there is job scarcity and that there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unable to be filled because this new skill set that is required. Now, obviously, what this means in inflationary terms is when people are in short supply, that what will happen is that they will demand higher wages, and this will have an inflationary impact as we go forward. So how would you recommend that in preparation for universities, if we look at the engaged universities and preparing students for the future, that we are mindful of the impact of this high skills structure that is being unfolded in front of us, but secondly, how do we ensure that the marginalized are not so significantly left behind, that the poor are once again subjected to high skills being rewarded, and this missing middle and poor individuals being further marginalized within our South African context? Professor Bharat, and I know that there's no one better to answer this question. Thank you.
Yes, so thanks, Linda. I mean, I think in a way the answer lies in the input you've given, which is namely that one does need a closer interaction between, let's call it universities of technology, technical colleges, the entire higher education space, and arguably employers. Because I think employers will give us the signals in a very granular sense. And there's some really good examples in South Africa of this information sharing between the demand and the supply side, let's call it, of labor. That'll allow curriculum redesign in real time to ensure that the graduates that are coming out are able to take up jobs, let's call them these new economy jobs or 4-hour type jobs. I think perhaps the simplest, most generic way to think about that is for the supply side to be looking for the core skills, whether it's in the STEMs, in computer science, in some of the, let's call it the soft skills areas where there's demand growing. That's the kind of generic skills that these institutions need to be looking towards. I just want to re-emphasize, and it based on what Hamida says as well, is that let's not forget that in this adjustment process, those in the middle of the distribution, at least from our research, those semi-skilled workers in routine type tasks, those jobs are going to fall away. And so the question as a society is, how do we find safety nets, or how do we provide, let's call it funding or support? It can be human capital upgrading support, but principally, I think, social grant type support for those workers that are actually going to lose their jobs in the adjustment process. I'm not sure, Lynn, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharat. You always provide great context for us just to reflect on these issues. Following on what you've said, I would like to turn to Ms. Didat. Ms. Didat, and I would like to ask you, if you were the Minister of Employment, what are the 2 policy issues that you would immediately implement, given the changing labor market, given the current economic situation that we face? What is that you would do if you were appointed? And I want to ask that your answer doesn't start off with that I will immediately resign. So please, just on a lighter note, I would like to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't resign. I think as the National Labour Economic Development Institute, it would be very well placed if we could actually just shift away from this neoliberal austerity measures and really start investing in human beings. I think the public sector, the possibilities for investment in human beings, the massive amounts of investment in skills and people, in children, in education, in innovation. I would ensure that both the basic education as well as the Department of Science and Technology as well as CHET, without any of the forms of corruption that they currently have, with very strong regulation, that all of that nonsense is cut out, but that you really start focusing on putting the money where the mouth is, which is investing in human capital. I mean, I don't necessarily support human capital in its theory in its entirety, but I think investing in people, I mean, if you look at what happened with Singapore, economically, it was in a really, really difficult situation, but all they did is they actually invested in people, in skills, in training, and they recognize the importance of having a social orientation in order to do that. I think that would be the one fundamental policy change that I would make, that obviously would have a major impact throughout different sectors. I think the second policy change would be from a gender perspective, because I do believe that the feminization of poverty is absolutely, it's disheartening. When you look at the levels of vulnerability, the exploitation, and the current economic burdens that women bear, both in the social reproductive space as well as in the formal and informal economies, I would fundamentally put in policies that drastically address the kind of abuse women are facing. Yeah, I think those would be the 2 fundamental changes that I'd make.
Thank you very much, Ms. Didas. And I just want to tell you that in crafting feminization and the poverty construct and the social ills that flow from that in such an eloquent manner is very helpful to the discourse. And I now turn to Professor Takir. Prof, what I want to ask you is, as universities prepare, as curriculum adaptation happens, as entrepreneurial constructs become increasingly more important, as we prepare our students, our graduates for the new normal, we see that our graduate unemployment rate is currently sitting just under 10%. What is it that universities should be doing differently? And what is it that we should be doing to hold ourselves to a higher standard to ensure that our students are able to provide for themselves? as they graduate and carry institutions' names, but not only about the program that they've completed. We must remember that taxpayers, before a student in a public institution does anything, taxpayers have funded 50% of that tuition fee. In many instances, it's much vaster. We know that we spent almost 43 billion rand on NSFAS this year. We know that the investment in students is that grants are being cut, but we also know that throughput rates are not great. What do we need to do, Prof? What lies at the heart of us reconstructing our reality so that as knowledge workers, we ensure that our students are better prepared? Professor Takir?
Thank you. I think that, firstly, we all understand the funding challenges that the nation has gone through from fees must fall to where we are, and we are where we are, right? So that's non-negotiable. But we also know that we need to re-engender a sense of value within our student population. That the funding that we have is going to become increasingly difficult for our government to start to actually maintain this funding cycle. And one of the things that I've been struggling with, and I know many years ago, when I used to do external evaluation at some of the universities, CUT comes to mind because it was one of my favorite places to go to for this particular reason. They had this project which they for students to do real world experience. They turned it around through the notion of CSR, perhaps know about this, community service learning as opposed to experiential learning. And I was so intrigued and happy by the notion of the project that they did. The students did real world projects for deserving NGOs and civil societies and companies and schools, small companies. So I think that if we could re-engender that kind of community service level contract through the notion of paying it forward. So we tell the students, look, not only would you be able to do this type of work for the benefit of a particular organization, it goes into your CV, it's reflective of you, and you'll be paying it forward, as it were. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Takir. I'm now going to wrap up the session by asking each of the speakers, including the respondents, I'm going to ask you just for your final thoughts within a minute or two as we wrap up. What are the final thoughts that you'd like to leave with us, given the context of the theme of the session that we were engaged in around entrepreneurship, modern technologies, and the labor market? What does it mean for us within our construct as South African citizens, within global citizens, as we move forward, keeping the theme in mind? So in closing, Professor Dimov, I would like you to please come back and just share your final thoughts with us within a minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayer. So it's been a great session, very insightful for me. They're not easy challenges ahead of us in any way. So my closing thought would be to draw a parallel. So the way I think of entrepreneurship and the way we might engage with it, not as necessarily a panacea that it's something we can see as guaranteed to work, but draw a parallel between entrepreneurship and sport. We engage in sport for the pleasure and sport develops quite a lot of important skills, and we should see entrepreneurship in the same spirit, as an area in which people can exercise aspirations, creativity, they can experiment, they can try and play, and out of that, just as great athletes emerge from, they can come from anywhere, so could the impactful ventures of tomorrow. So we need to give them the space to emerge.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ms. Didat, if I could ask you please just to come back with your final thoughts.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Dr. Morris. I think my final thoughts would be, this is an opportunity for absolute innovation and creation. I think it could, depending on how we approach it, lead to a fundamental way of us addressing the key levels of unemployment. I think I was very enthused by, even business partners, when we engaged at the Presidential Commission on the 4IR, where everyone really made a strong commitment to the fact that we do not want to see higher levels of unemployment in our country, but we want to invest in skills, and we want to see a stronger match between education, and the labor markets. I think if we can fundamentally make that transformation, I think we'd transform everybody's lives. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Professor Takir?
I think that my closing remark, and thank you so much, colleagues, my closing remark is that we should start doing things at scale and fail forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Bharat, in closing, I'd like you, obviously in your minute or two, just to wrap up for us before closing, and just please share the seminal thoughts. You know, we always say, unless Professor Bharat has said that, we don't really believe it in the economy. So thank you, Professor Bharat.
Thank you, Dr. Mayor. Linda, it's very kind of you. I mean, my sense is a little bit feeding off what some excellent questions actually in the chat group, right? Is that it's a little bit about having a composite policy response to what we know is coming through the economy in the form of new technologies. And it's partly about reorientating the higher education system so that the signals that are coming through are very clear to the higher education system that you need to provide those skills, whether it's upskilling or new graduates need to have skills that are in need and in demand by employers, noting that the fourth industrial revolution is here to stay. Then in the second instance, it's also about realizing that there will be adjustment costs and having a policy response in place for those adjustment costs. I think that is absolutely essential. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that there won't be adjustment costs that we do need to take care of as a very specific policy response to those workers who essentially may lose their jobs because of this exogenous shock. And then I think the third is the positive response, is that in the long run, if we can find and slipstream into those, let's call it new technology jobs, provide the skills that are required, monitor universities so that they're not reproducing skills for unemployment, but for employment, we then can start talking about that skills growth nexus that's actually very virtuous. And I think that's the positive space to be in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharat. To our esteemed panel, I would like to thank you, Professor Takir, Professor Bharat, Professor Dimov, and to our chairperson for the first session, Professor Mtose, as well as to our very welcome respondent, Ms. Didat. On behalf of Dr. Nora Clark, who is the head of the World of Work Integrated Strategy Group and also the WSG at USAf, we thank you from USAf, from our board, for participating. This was a very engaging and insightful session, and we thank you. We wish you a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.